You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Paramaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you, Prashant. How are you doing today?
Good.
Great. So I apologize to listeners, first of all, for the hiatus again in the podcast. I've been doing a lot of travel recently. I actually just got back from almost 2 weeks in South Korea. And as our listeners probably know, this was a very interesting time to visit South Korea. So this podcast is going to be primarily about South Korea. It is not going to be a North Korea podcast. Believe it or not, it is possible to have an enriching discussion about South Korea's role in Asia at large without being drawn into North Korea. But of course, we will talk a bit about U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's recent visit to Pyongyang. But first, before we get into any of that, I do want to take a break and do something unusual on the podcast. As you usually know, we like to get right into our business. But I want to take a brief minute to actually tell our podcast listeners about a new product that we have with The Diplomat that might interest them. And when I say product, I don't mean something that we're selling to you. It is a free new editorial product that we have. It's a newsletter that I'm writing. It's called the Asia-Pacific Risk Update. Maybe I should have called it the Indo-Pacific Risk Update, given that we are releasing it in 2018. But hey, we're The Diplomat. We do the Asia-Pacific still. But this newsletter, effectively, it's coming out bi-weekly right now, and it's sort of my take on the top geopolitical issues that you should be paying attention to across Asia's major regions. So if you're somebody that's primarily interested in one Asian sub-region, let's say you're a Southeast Asianist or a Northeast Asianist or a China expert or an India watcher, and you want to have a better picture of how things kind of interconnect in Asia, because Asia is growing more connected than ever, or if you simply just want to know what's going on in Central Asia or Oceania, I recommend you check out the newsletter. It's sort of my attempt to kind of pull together the big picture in Asia and just help sift through and separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. So you can subscribe to that newsletter at diplomat.substack.com. We're using a new mail provider, Substack. They've been very helpful to us. But I do hope you'll subscribe to that. And of course, because this is a new product and it's sort of experimental, I'm totally open to receiving feedback. And actually, a lot of subscribers have written in already with very helpful feedback about the newsletter. So if you have any feedback on that, I'd be very happy to hear it. So with that said, Prashant, let's get into today's discussion. So it's funny because, I'm from India and I was in Korea, and while I was there, South Korean President Moon Jae-in actually went to India for a visit with Prime Minister Modi. And I know the Moon administration was a little bit caught off guard by the timing because they also had to account for the fact that Pompeo was going to Pyongyang, but South Korea managed to demonstrate that it was a Indo-Pacific minded country. Moon went to India. He's no longer there, but he had a very productive visit with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi there, emphasizing the variety of economic, security, and political linkages between the two countries, even people-to-people linkages. They signed a range of important agreements. But Prashant, where I'm taking this really isn't to talk to you about the South Korea-India relationship. You had a very interesting piece that I think merits a close discussion today, which is you looked at South Korea's, at least the Moon government's, new southern strategy in the context of Southeast Asia, but certainly it has implications in South Asia as well. So I was hoping to turn it over to you. You can maybe tell us a bit about what the new southern strategy is for South Korea and how you sort of see it playing out geopolitically in South and Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good place to start, Ankit, because as you framed it in the beginning, I think a lot of the discussion has been sort of a question of, how much of South Korea's foreign policy under the Moon government has been dominated by North Korea relative to other, Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific concerns, right? And I think that's where the new Southern policy comes in. I mean, there's any number of names, policies, initiatives. There's a new Northern policy. There's a Southern policy. But I do think the Moon government is trying to demonstrate that even though it does have this North Korea challenge, there is plenty of other things that South Korea wants to do, and a lot of this is just focused on South Korea as a middle power and sort of engaging other middle powers and significant countries in the region. So that's kind of how you frame the sort of new Southern policy. Part of that is Southeast Asia, and Moon, after his visit to India, has moved on to Singapore, where he's trying to engage Singapore, but also Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And the India visit, too, I think is a demonstration that South Korea wants to engage major powers in the Asia Pacific. And I guess with both these legs of the visits, I mean, there have been a focus on, particular deliverables, like when he was in India, announcing that, there was this commitment to $50 billion of trade by 2030. But I think for both legs of the visit, it really does come down to this question of how much of bandwidth does South Korea have in its foreign policy, relative to what it has on with respect to North Korea. And I think in that vein, it was interesting that this visit or sets of visits came alongside Pompeo's visit. And since you were in South Korea recently and you follow North Korea very closely, I mean, I think we should probably move that discussion there and then come back. What were your impressions when you were in South Korea about how South Korea is walking this balance, right, between the North Korea challenge, but also these broader foreign policy challenges? Like we heard in the Shangri-La dialogue when you and I were there, I mean, there were folks raising questions, right? Can South Korea walk and chew gum at the same time, and how is this going to play out?
No, those are great questions. And the first thing I'll say is that my visit to South Korea, actually, believe it or not, was about a lot of other things apart from North Korea. I had a lot of very interesting conversations with South Korean sort of policy elites, opinion makers, even a few expat analysts who live there and know the country very well, just about how South Korea is envisaging its place in Asia's shifting geopolitical order between the United States and China, the shifting nature of the alliance, the implication of America first for South Korea, and I also had a lot of conversations about more granular and difficult historical issues like the issue of the comfort women dispute with Japan and the Dokdo territorial dispute and even the East Sea naming issue dispute. So this was actually a really wide-ranging trip. And I also spoke with South Korean civil society organizations. Young South Koreans, old South Koreans, liberal South Koreans, conservative South Koreans. So I feel like I walked away with a pretty helpful picture of just where several segments of South Korean society are in thinking about a lot of these foreign policy issues. Obviously, I can't claim that I walked away with an understanding of what quote unquote South Koreans think, because South Korea is a vibrant democracy and people disagree there just as much in any other country. So there are a range of perspectives. Obviously, the Moon administration has its own view of where things are going and should go, but otherwise, there are a range of issues. So on the issue that you just brought up of walking and chewing gum, I think that's very much something that people in South Korea are aware of, at least among the foreign policy elite. Yes, it's true that there is a lot of optimism and interest right now in the inter-Korean process, and certainly I think a lot of people sense that Moon here has an opportunity that is quite different from what his predecessors Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun had in 2000 and 2007 respectively. So there is a lot of interest in making that the primary issue. But obviously, if you talk to other South Koreans, I mean, what's on their minds is the country's economic vitality and future. And for that, very much, you hear something like the new Southern policy and you think of something like, Taiwan's new southbound policy, looking for opportunity in the vibrant, demographically strong Southeast Asian and South Asian region. So I think in South Korea, similarly, to maintain the country's vitality, participating in regional free trade arrangements, increasing trade volumes, and really reaching out to South and Southeast Asia is, I think, still thought of as a way to sustain economic vitality. And that is an important issue for Koreans. I think a lot of people do not feel particularly positive about the direction of the South Korean economy. And, we often talk about demographic decline in Japan. That is a very popular topic in the Western press and talking about Asian demographic issues. But South Korea has a worse demographic problem. They have a lower fertility rate than Japan, and it's very much an issue that the country is wrangling with now too. So they're an aging society again, and thinking about how that can be managed. The role that immigration from Southeast Asia, for instance, will play in South Korea. So those are some of the issues that I found to be quite interesting in some of the conversations I had there.
And just to sort of elaborate a little bit on a point that you made earlier, I mean, I do think it is interesting to acknowledge and talk about the fact that there are a diverse set of viewpoints in all of these countries, right? In the
Right.
Indo-Pacific that we talk about, and South Korea is an example. I think one of the things, and listeners, I would encourage you to sort of read through our new newsletter because there are a lot of good insights and analysis there. But I think one of the insights that you brought up there, Ankit, and we can talk about it here too, is views within South Korea about the future of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, right?
Hmm.
In the context of the younger generation, in the context of the changing context and climate of inter-Korean relations, what is the relevance of the U.S. South Korea alliance, depending on the various scenarios and how those play out? I mean, what were some of the insights that you picked up on that during your trip?
Oh man, this could be a whole podcast, to be honest. The alliance is in a very it's in a very interesting place, and it's in a precarious place. And if I was someone that supported the alliance, and I am, I would be worried. And I did walk away from South Korea a little worried about the alliance, but I also felt, a small tinge of hope in that you do talk to a lot of South Koreans, and maybe this is just my sample size, but when I go to DC and I talk to people about the U.S. Korea alliance, the general view that I walk away with is that American thinking about alliances, and especially the alliance with South Korea, is a lot more rigid, and people are a lot more resistant to change. In South Korea right now, and here I'm really referring to, I guess, partisans of the Moon government, and at least a couple people in the administration, they're more open to revisiting the nature of the alliance, right? So there was that controversial article in Foreign Affairs in May before the summit, written by Moon's advisor, Moon Chung-in, which made the case that it would be very difficult to justify a U.S. troop presence in South Korea if there is a peace treaty, which is a common view in South Korea. It's been a long-standing view that a lot of Americans have been aware of, is that a consequence of peace with North Korea is that the U.S.-Korea alliance, as it exists today, would no longer be able to persist. But what I found is that even in the South Korean left, even among the progressives, that is something that people are not very seriously entertaining. People are invested in the alliance, and they are thinking more carefully about what it would mean for South Korea to revisit the alliance with the United States and sort of re-architect it in a way designed to help it become something more like an Indo-Pacific balancer, a little bit more like the U.S.-Japan alliance. And they're thinking about issues like the transfer of operational control. I won't get into that on the podcast because it's kind of a in-the-weeds topic related to primarily South Korean military procurement. But if listeners are interested in this, I encourage you to read more about it. It's called the OPCON transfer issue. It's about making the wartime command of forces on the Korean Peninsula more equitable. The South Korean left certainly sees it as a sovereignty issue. And here I think, domestic politics are quite relevant. I stayed in a couple of hotels when I was in Seoul, and continuously I would see protesters outside, and the protesters were primarily conservative South Koreans, and they all carried American flags, a Korean flag in one hand and an American flag in the other, chanting in support of the alliance, in support of Park Geun-hye in a lot of cases, the imprisoned and disgraced former president, Moon's predecessor. But the thing that I really also walked away with is that even if you talk to right-leaning South Koreans who maybe sympathized with a more conservative government's agenda, a lot of these people are aware that the South Korean conservatives are effectively electorally in a very bad place right now, right? It's you look at South Korea, you see a conservative polity that's in disarray, and it's kind of the same thing with the liberals and the left in Japan, where the LDP dominates. So you have a little bit of parallelism there. But basically what people worry about, obviously, is that you have sort of polarization right now among certain parts of the South Korean left, perhaps the Moon Chung-in school of alliance thinking, and obviously the Donald Trump school of alliance thinking, and you put those forces together and you allow them to sort of play out. And I think a lot of people worry that the forces here end up pulling the alliance apart. And we have, burden sharing talks underway right now. The special measures agreement talks are undergoing in the alliance, and that's an area for tension. Donald Trump has not taken an interest in that, which I think is a good thing. But at any minute, he could learn of the fact that, we're talking to South Korea about dollars and cents. And actually, another thing I'll say is that when I was there, these conversations were actually particularly charged because the Camp Humphreys, the largest U.S. overseas naval base at Pyeongtaek, which replaces the Yongsan garrison, which was the U.S. Military's garrison in the heart of Seoul, in northern Seoul, opened, and South Korea paid 90% of the tab for this base, right? So it's really a crystallization of just how skewed in some ways the burden sharing commitment is, and how it's completely disparate from how Trump sees it. So actually, this is a somewhat politically and emotionally charged issue too. I mean, South Koreans do feel disrespected on one level, I think, at least some of them that I talk to, by the way Trump speaks about the alliance. So yeah, I'm worried about the alliance, but it is encouraging to see that a lot of Koreans, even on the left, are open to the idea of thinking things through for a potential future in which peace with North Korea does take hold and there is a peace treaty.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do think, the drivers that you mentioned, whether it's domestic politics or popular perceptions are things that you look at, U.S. alliances throughout the region. You do see those as major drivers. I think the other thing that's been interesting is, the Moon government's sense of threat perceptions, right? So when you see alliances and the perception of threat with respect to North Korea, it does seem like the Moon government has quite a relatively optimistic view of where the North Koreans are and the North Korean threat, and that also creates expectations that need to be managed in the context of the alliance as well, right? I think you noted in the newsletter as well, one of your observations was that with respect to that, um, depending on whether that optimism may be borne out or not, it is something that we'll have to compare with reality, right? In terms of where the North Koreans develop with respect to the nuclear issue. And I think the other thing that you mentioned that's really important is this notion of troop withdrawals and troop presence. That's something that has a regional a regional sort of sense or regional implications as well, right? So if you look at U.S. troop presence in the region, whenever you have major U.S. troop withdrawals or talk of that, right, whether it's after the Vietnam War or after the end of the Cold War, that generates all kinds of regional anxieties about, what does it say about, U.S. commitment or regional stability or, who else is going to pick up the slack, if U.S. troops are withdrawn. So I think there's always this hype and sense of things. But if you look at the broad historical trajectory, what has happened is you have that sense of hype, and then what you have is a troop drawdown or reduction after that period of hype, as opposed to a full-scale withdrawal. So to your point, I do think it is important to, as we talk about, the alliance is it in good shape, is it in bad shape, there are sort of various degrees of moderation in between. And I suspect that, we're in those periods right now where I think folks are wondering, what does this look like in terms of the U.S.-South Korea alliance going forward? So.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. And I know we're not really in the business of doing policy recommendations on the podcast, but if there are listeners listening to this in Washington, I'd say that one of the things that the United States needs to be ready for, and I know that maybe in the Trump era this is actually slightly easier, is that the alliance doesn't have to look like it has for the past a decade plus, right? We forget that in the early 1990s, the U.S. and North Korea completely, rethought the alliance in the context of the post-Cold War environment. They canceled the team spirit exercise to make way for diplomacy with North Korea. Today, there's a similar thing, right? Like there was a lot of hand-wringing in D.C. about Trump's sort of unilateral decision to cancel the upcoming Ulchi Freedom Guardian exercise, the computerized command post exercise, which he called a very provocative war game. Okay, that's, frankly, offensive to the South Korean and American soldiers that participate in the defensive exercise. But the point I'm trying to make is that, we all hope that this peace process with North Korea, leaving denuclearization aside, the inter-Korean peace effort does succeed, and the Korean people can make something out of this. And if that happens, I think the alliance will have to change, right? So it doesn't have to completely disappear overnight. But the point you made about moderation is important because we need to ask questions like, do the U.S. and South Korea, I think they do need to exercise to maintain readiness, but do they need to have, Key Resolve Full Eagle and then UFG in August every year? And is that the kind of alliance calendar that we need to maintain? Or can it be broken up into smaller exercises, more low-profile exercises that will be less, quote-unquote, provocative to North Korea? Does the U.S. need to necessarily have 28,500 troops on the Korean Peninsula, or could it have less? It could have less, right? I mean, those issues are, I think, where the conversation will probably have to go. The alternative scenario is that this whole process with North Korea collapses and we go back to fire and fury and brinkmanship, in which case the alliance discussion, I think, becomes very different, even in South Korea. But right now, I think that this is a seriously urgent issue that I think needs to be thought about a little bit more flexibly in Washington.
Right. And I guess one of the variables in terms of how you think about the alliance and U.S.-South Korea relations more generally, I mean, is the North Korea issue, and you mentioned, Pompeo's visit, and what we've seen a lot of commentary about the degree to which it was a failure, or whether this was something that was expected following the hype that came out of the summit. What were the impressions that you picked up in South Korea, and your impressions about what Pompeo trip, how the Pompeo trip fared, but also what does that trip kind of say about what we could see from the U.S. and North Korea going forward in terms of this process, but also the potential endgame?
Yeah, no, this was a little bit sad for me because I actually just left South Korea right as Pompeo left North Korea, and I was at the
Hmm.
airport actually when I saw the North Korean Foreign Ministry statement,
Right.
calling him out for his gangster-like attitude, and then I boarded my 13-hour flight, not knowing what I'd come back to on the other side. There was no internet on the flight, but I had a lot of time to think about that North Korean Foreign Ministry statement on the long flight. Look, I mean, on one hand, this is unexpected, but I think the bigger thing for me is that I think the U.S. just doesn't like the Singapore Declaration that Trump signed on to, or is at least not interested in reading the text and seeing what Trump and Kim Jong Un signed to. Because before, Pompeo went to Pyongyang this time, he, or maybe this was the State Department spokesperson speaking on his behalf, but said that he was going there to realize the final fully verified denuclearization of North Korea, comma, as agreed to by Chairman Kim in Singapore.
Hmm.
Which is, I mean, it's a completely made up thing. First of all,
Yeah.
Chairman Kim did not agree to that in Singapore. He agreed to work towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which is a very different thing. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and denuclearization of North Korea mean different things. And North Korea has never signed on to any kind of statement that implies that it would unilaterally disarm. And the North Koreans have been trying to tell the Americans this all throughout this year. And I try to read the North Korean paper every day. It's probably not good for my mental health, but I do it anyways. And look, the North Koreans have put out multiple statements on May 16th when John Bolton was talking about the Libya model being the only model for North Korea. Kim Kye-gwan, the vice foreign minister, or the vice minister of foreign affairs, said that we won't, as long as unilateralism is what you're looking for, we can't have the summit. And then, of course, Trump cancels the summit later and he grovels and they manage to make it work. But, that's the same thing with this Pompeo visit. What came out afterwards in that foreign ministry statement is that unfortunately the U.S. came to the table not looking to talk to us in the spirit of the Singapore Declaration, but only continuing to demand for denuclearization, calling for CVID, declaration and verification, all of which run counter to the spirit of the Singapore summit meeting and talks, right? That's very important. Think back to that press conference that Pompeo had right after the Singapore summit when he berated a reporter for asking him where the words verification and irreversible were in the Singapore Declaration. And Pompeo said that, oh, don't worry about it. The North Koreans understand that the word complete implies verifiable and irreversible, but the North Koreans are very clear that it does not. So what's the takeaway from all this? The simple takeaway is that the U.S., if it is going to have productive talks with North Korea, and here by productive I mean talks that focus on things like, capping North Korean ICBM production, fissile material production. I mean, fissile material production would be a total pipe dream at this point, so that'd be great. But to get to any of that, right, to just get past the hump, even to get the POW MIA remains out of North Korea. The U.S. will have to stop insisting on unilateral denuclearization. So if Pompeo goes next time to Pyongyang, the terms for that conversation need to focus around complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which for North Korea, if I can offer my view on what they think of that, I think they really mean something like global nuclear disarmament, right? Like something like what
Yeah.
a NPT nuclear state signs on to with Article 6 of the NPT,
Hmm.
which says that if you're a nuclear state, you're going to vie for a world without nuclear weapons. So that's basically what North Korea has agreed to with the Singapore Declaration. Pompeo doesn't like it. Trump doesn't like it. John Bolton definitely doesn't like it. And that's what leads me to think that this process is probably doomed for failure. But I really hope I'm wrong about that because I think the U.S. could get a lot out of this if it simply got over the unilateral disarmament component.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, what Pompeo's trip and kind of the aftermath of the summit has shown us is that I think there were some folks who were saying, well, the summit, the statement, at least something happened, at least they had an agreement, at least they were talking, and maybe, we shouldn't sweat so much the small stuff. And there were folks like us who were saying, well, you should really focus on the specifics, though. I mean, these commitments matter, and North Korea will kind of hold you to them. And sure enough, that's exactly what has happened, right? I mean, the North Koreans are referencing what was agreed. And if you make certain concessions or language seems diluted, there's risks to that, even if you're making a compromise to hold a summit and to just issue a statement. And I think, that's kind of what we're seeing. And we're also kind of seeing a dynamic where the U.S. is trying to portray the North Koreans as the unreasonable party, and the North Koreans are coming back and saying, "Well, no, you're the unreasonable party." And I suspect we'll be seeing some of that playing out. I guess the big question that, to my mind, it keeps coming back to me is, I mean, where are we relative to where we were before, right? Is this something that's kind of back to square one in terms of where we were with the North Korea challenge? Or potentially is this, worse, where we've kind of taken one step forward and two steps backwards, right? Because if you think to what the Trump administration was doing before, we were initially headed to war with North Korea or potential conflict, but there was this toughening sanctions regime that was getting us to the point of negotiations. And the fact that the summit came so quickly, and the statement was drafted so quickly, and the momentum is kind of dissipating on sanctions, and we're at a point right now where, yeah, I'm not sure if it's sort of something that's doomed to failure, or whether we should be hopeful about where this goes forward. But it does seem that this idea that Trump is a masterful negotiator and bargainer, this is a big test of that, and I am not sure that this so far has been working in his favor.
Oh, you're too polite. But yeah, I think you're onto something there. No, I mean, this is something I've been thinking about, and debating with a few people, because a lot of people do make the point that talks are better than war, and of course they are, right? It's we're definitely in a better place now than we were in December 2017 when we were reading reports about bloody nose strikes and what have you. But the worry, of course, is that Trump thinks that Kim Jong-un has betrayed him, and he thinks that when he met Kim in Singapore and they became honorable friends or whatever, that Kim told him he would denuclearize. He signed a piece of paper that says complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Trump probably thinks that means that North Korea is going to give up its nukes. It doesn't mean that. So when it doesn't happen, Trump says, Kim double-crossed me. He did this with Harley Davidson. He lashed out at them on Twitter. So does he lash out at Kim Jong-un and say, all right, Mr. Kim, your time is over, I'm coming for you, and does that start a nuclear war? I mean, that sounds like a ridiculous scenario, but it is kind of the extreme end of how this thing could completely blow up in everyone's faces. I'm not willing to call Pompeo's trip actually a total failure, because they're still talking, and the North Korean statement was very clear that, as long as we build on the spirit that Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump fostered in Singapore, we can continue to talk. So they're willing to talk. There's working group level talks set up right now. That said, I'm not optimistic. The North Koreans are very good at slow rolling that process. But the thing you said about sanctions is, I think, also really valid. Maximum pressure is 100% dead right now. Chinese have totally eased up on implementation. I mean, why would they when North Korea is behaving in a frankly reasonable manner, right? The reasonableness question is also interesting because North Korea does have a point that if the U.S. doesn't like what the Singapore Declaration says, they shouldn't have signed it, right? If Trump went to Singapore and that was the agreement and it wasn't acceptable to him or his administration, then it's entirely reasonable. My policy preferences aside, it's entirely reasonable for a U.S. president to shape his foreign policy based on what he actually wants. So if he doesn't want the Singapore Declaration, then he shouldn't sign it. And also going back further to March, if Trump had sort of said, no, I'm not going to accept Kim Jong-un's invitation for a summit right now because our sanctions pressure is really starting to accelerate and might actually accomplish something, I'm not sold on that argument, but it's an argument that I think you can make quite reasonably. Then that also leads to a different outcome, I think. But Kim Jong-un managed to, get Trump to take the bait on the summit, get a really weak statement out of the Singapore summit. And now if the process collapses and we enter a conflict, obviously that backfires for him. But I think he thinks that he can get away with it. And now I think the next step, and this is something I again talked about in Seoul, is how we get to sanctions relief. And I don't mean total relief. I mean probably roll back to where we were at the end of 2016, which means rolling back the 3 resolutions from last year, which were really unprecedented in scope in that they restrict about 90% of North Korea's exports, which does affect the regime's bottom line in a significant way. So We might see China and Russia begin to support that as long as North Korea keeps on playing ball in the inter-Korean sense and with the United States. So really, Kim Jong-un got a pretty good deal out of this, and it does look like the U.S. is in a bit of a pickle right now, unless they choose to give up denuclearization.
Yeah,
Well,
I'd agree with that.
all right. Well, yeah. So I guess we did end up talking a lot about North Korea. So maybe we failed the task that I set out at the beginning, which was to talk about South Korea without being drawn into North Korea. But I guess these are the times we're in right now in July 2018. But Prashant, thanks a lot for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Right. For our listeners, the usual spiel. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do so. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't left us a rating on iTunes or Google Play, please do so too. That really helps get the word out about the show. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.